Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, so today we will be examining Sutta number 137 in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is called the Saḻāyatanavibhanga Sutta, which means the... Excuse me? Oh. Okay, so this is the Saḻāyatanavibhanga Sutta, which means the exposition, or even better, analysis of the Sixfold Base. But actually, as we'll see, the Sixfold Base is only the beginning point of the sutta, and it actually goes on to cover a variety of other topics. Okay, so the sutta begins when the Buddha is living in Sravasti, in Jeta's Grove, and then this is a sutta that the Buddha is going to give of his own accord, not in response to an inquiry from others, not in response to a particular situation. So he just announces to the monks that I will teach you an exposition of the Sixfold Base. Listen and attend closely, and then he goes on. He begins with, this is what we call the Uddesa, the kind of outline or summary of the topics he's going to cover. And then he will go into the Vibhanga, the analysis, or the Nidesa, the exposition. Okay, so the Uddesa, the summary, the concise teaching, the outline is the 6 internal sense bases should be understood, the 6 external sense bases should be understood, the 6 classes of consciousness should be understood, the 18 kinds of mental exploration should be understood, the 36 positions of being should be understood. Then, by depending on this, abandon that. Then there are 3 foundations of mindfulness that the Noble One cultivates, cultivating which the Noble One is a teacher fit to instruct a group. Among the teachers of training, it is he that is called the incomparable or the unsurpassed leader of persons to be tamed. So this is the summary, that's the Uddesa. So we have this contrast. The Uddesa is the summary, and that will be followed by the Vibhanga, the analysis. And the analysis can also be called Nidesa, That is the elaboration or exposition. So you could see how sort of methodically and systematically the Buddha is in his way of organizing his teaching. So it begins with the 6 internal bases. And here the word for the internal bases is ajatika ayatana, and the counterpart, the external bases, of bahira ayatana. The word ayatana is used in a variety of senses within the Buddhist texts. For example, the objects of the formless meditations are called, for example, akasa ananchayatana, the base of the boundlessness of space, or vinyananchayatana, the base of the boundlessness of consciousness, nevasanyana sanyayatana, the base of neither perception nor non-perception. But here, we could see that what is meant by base, internal base and external base, are, you can call these the bases for the arising of consciousness. And so, this, you could say that the focus of the Buddha's teaching, the whole focus is on the nature of conscious experience. And so the Buddha goes into a very, very extensive, elaborate analysis of the mind and mental functions, how consciousness arises, how different activities of the mind occur on the basis of consciousness. And all of this is sort of established upon 2 foundations, which are called the 2 kinds of bases. We have the internal sense bases, which are also called the doors. The internal sense bases. Actually, you could see the close connection between that English and Pali belong to the same family of languages, since the word for door here is dwara. And so the door is the particular, the portal or opening or base through which the mind goes out into the external world, or into the objective world, and makes contact with objects. And the door is also the portal or opening through which objects are able to enter within and become known by the mind. And so there are 6 internal bases, which are the eye base, ear base, nose base, tongue base, body base, and the mind base. And normally we would tend to think of the eye base as being simply this physical organ that we call the eye, the ear base as this thing that we call the ear. But the Buddhist, the Abhidhamma, the commentaries give a more technical explanation of what is meant by the eye base. So they speak about a particular type of matter which is not the external eyeball, but is located somewhere within the eyeball, which is sensitive to light and to color. Maybe in terms of modern physiology, we can speak of anatomy or physiology. We could call this the rods and cones in the retina. And the air base is not, by the air base is not meant this particular structure here, since if we cut this off, we could still hear. I hope so. Don't experiment on me. But what's meant by the air base is a very subtle kind of matter, someplace, deep within the inner channel of the air, which is able to receive and respond to sounds. And then the nose is not this thing that sticks out here, but a particular type of material substance, maybe way up in the nostrils, which is able to pick up odors. And so this is called, I don't think the term comes in the suttas, but it comes in the Abhidhamma. It's called pasada rupa. Which is most easily translated, well, most conveniently translated as sensitive matter. The matter within the gross sense organs, which is specifically capable of picking up, receiving the corresponding type of sense objects. Okay, and then we have the mind base, which is not to be understood as the brain or nervous system, but the mind base is always understood within the Buddhist. The mind base is actually not explained at all within the suttas. It's always just taken for granted that one understands what the Buddha is talking about. And then the commentaries based on the Abhidhamma give a rather complicated explanation. But we could understand, or I would understand, the mind base as being simply the mental organ of inward reflection. And so let us say, think of the square root of 4. Okay, when you think of the square root of 4, you're not seeing anything with the eyes, you're not hearing any sounds, you're not putting oranges out on the table and trying to figure out how many, 4 oranges on the table, and trying to look at them and figure out how they turn into a square root of 4. But you are reflecting inwardly with your mind based on your understanding of what a square root means to figure out what is the square root of 4. And then, of course, you come up with a 3, right? Oh. Why is everybody laughing? Excuse me? Really? Not 4? Maybe I have to go back to it. Okay, I know, I'm just joking. Okay, so we take the mind to be what I call the object of internal reflection. But, this is a subtle point, the mind base has its own distinct class of objects, which we're going to come to, which are called dhammas. Maybe I'll take the objects first, then I'll come to this point. Okay, we have the 6 internal bases, then the 6 external bases, which are the 6 counterparts of the internal sense bases, or the objects of those sense bases, or the objects corresponding to those sense bases. And these are also called, I think the word is used in this sense a bit later than the old Nikayas, aramana. Aramana means literally that which one hangs on to, that which one depends upon. And it comes to mean the object of experience. And so corresponding to the first 5 sense bases, you could see right off the bat the natural object of those sense bases. So for the eye, there are visible forms. For the ear, there are sounds. For the nose, there's odors. The tongue, the counterpart, are tastes. And for the body, there is what's called potaba, which we could translate as tactile objects, or the tactile sensations. Okay, then the counterpart of the mind base, the text use a word with many meanings. What is the external counterpart of the mind base? Anybody know what word? If you don't know the word, I want the Pali word. Right, very good. Dhamma. With the long A to indicate that it's a plural. So we have the word Dhamma used in so many senses in the suttas, in the sense of teach. Well, as a singular, it's the Dhamma, that is the Buddha's teaching. But Dhamma can also mean various teachings, many teachings. Then we have Dhamma as qualities, mental qualities. And here we have Dhamma used in the sense of, it's often translated as mind objects or mental objects. And so we can take the counterpart, the objective counterpart of the mind base, to be objects that are not sensory but purely mental qualities. The one example mentioned is ideas, concepts, mental images, judgments, propositions, square root of 4. No, this is a serious example. That would be a purely mental object. But where it gets a little tricky and interesting is that the mind base can take as its object not only purely mental objects, but the mind base can also take objects of the 5 other senses. For example, if I look at a color chart, I could see various shades of blue. So I distinguish this shade of blue is darker, this shade of blue is lighter, this shade of blue is brighter, this shade of blue is duller. So I compare these different shades of blue. So what's going on here? The first base that's involved is the eye base, taking as object colors. But then the mind base steps in and then starts to compare the colors and distinguish them. Or when I'm speaking, okay, you hear intelligible words. I hope so. Why you laugh? I didn't praise myself and say intelligent words. Whether intelligent or not, dog bites cat, bites. Dhammas revolves around I base. Okay, it's completely unintelligent nonsense, but the words are intelligible. Now I lost track of what I was saying. Oh yeah, you're hearing me say intelligible words. Okay, what is happening? What you're just picking up with the ear base are sounds, but it's the mind base that supervenes on the activity of the ear base and then turns those sounds, those sound vibrations into meaningful words. Okay, so this is the mind base can take as its object the objects of all the other senses. Okay, so these are the 12 sense bases. And as I said, we call them ayatana bases because they are the bases for consciousness. And so in the next scheme that we have here, we have the 6 classes of consciousness which should be understood. And so here we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose, tongue, body, and purely mental consciousness or mind consciousness. Okay, so the eye by itself doesn't experience anything, but the eye is just a base for forms. It's just a base or a door for forms to become accessible to consciousness. And so for each pair of internal and external sense bases, we have a corresponding type of consciousness. So we have Okay, so I think the situation regarding each of the 5 types of sensory consciousness should be clear. Eye consciousness is the consciousness which is aware only of visible forms. The eye consciousness doesn't have access to sounds, odors, tastes, or tactile sensations. And so each of the other types of sensory consciousness has access only to its own respective object. Now the situation gets perhaps a little more complicated with the mind dhammas, mind objects, and mind consciousness. In fact, the problem, what is the relationship between mind and mind consciousness, became, what I say is that what is somewhat puzzling, first of all, is that in the suttas, in the Nikayas, nobody comes to the Buddha and says, Bhante, what is the relationship between mano and mano-vijnana, between mind and mind consciousness? I've always found this, even from my early days as studying Buddhism, very frustrating. Why doesn't anybody come and ask the Buddha that question? It's always just taken for granted. Monks, there are these 6 types of consciousness based upon the mind and dhammas. There arises mind consciousness. Evang Bhante, yes, Venerable Sir. Nobody says, how are they interrelated? And so this became a problem for, or at least a question for, like the later generations of Buddhist savants, or maybe it was even discussed amongst the circle of the Buddha's disciples, which led to the clarification, or let's say the elaboration in the Abhidhamma system. So then, I shouldn't let the cat out of the bag. To find the details, you have to register for the Abhidhamma retreat. But actually, it almost does. We call this sutta, I would call this a pre-Abhidhamma sutta, and that it's the kind of text that functions almost as the nucleus out of which the seed out of which the Abhidhamma would have developed. And so different schools of Buddhism worked out different answers to this question on the relation of the mano to mano-vijnana. And so in the Theravada school, where they devise a scheme of 89 types of cittas, then mano becomes identified with 3 types of cittas, mano-vijnana with 76 types of cittas. But I try to see it pretty simply, to keep it pretty simple, and I think maybe the Buddha was really speaking at a more sort of direct, experiential, pragmatic level. Just think of mano as being the organ or faculty of knowing non-sensory objects, and mind consciousness is that which actually knows those non-sensory objects of consciousness. And I'm using the Pali. Okay, mind consciousness also knows the objects of the other senses, just as the mind base can objectify the objects of the other bases. So mind consciousness can know the objects of the other senses. It can know different shades of color. It can turn sounds into words. When you get, past a restaurant, that's Indian cuisine. That's Chinese cuisine. How do we know this? Just through interpreting smell. But it's not the nose consciousness that knows Indian cuisine or Turkish cuisine or Chinese cuisine. But it is the mind consciousness. And so when we take the 6 internal bases, the 6 external bases, the 6 types of consciousness, we put them all together, then we get a scheme which is not mentioned as a class here, but this is a scheme called the 18 dhatus, the 18 elements. So the 18 elements are the 6 doors or internal sense bases, the 6 objects, and the 6 classes of consciousness. Yes, 6 doors or internal sense bases, 6 objects or external sense bases, and 6 classes of consciousness. So putting them all together in a simple way, what I call the sutta style of exposition. We call these, without bringing in the Abhidhammic analysis, we call these the 18 dhatus, the 18 elements. Okay, any questions at this point? Yes, Chris. I think she's going to hand you a microphone. Oh, here it is.
Thanks. Are any of these things things that we can actually perceive? Like, so if I see the color blue, where does that fall in? It's just an object of consciousness. This is.
Wait, I'm not sure I catch the
So of these 18 dhatus, what are just kind of inferred to exist, and what can be apprehended directly, can be observed?
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Certainly, the six types, the six objects can be, experientially apprehended. The six types of consciousness we can experience, reflectively. Of course, if I see a form with the eye, maybe at the moment that I'm actually seeing, then I can't simultaneously be aware of my eye consciousness. But a few moments after, I can reflect back and know that since I saw a form with the eye, that there was the eye consciousness involved in knowing the form and seeing the form. Okay,
so that sounds kind of like an interpretation of your experience, like.
I wouldn't say it's an interpretation, but certain things can only, when they're occurring in their immediacy, they can't be known, let's say conceptually, or let's say, let me put this, on an occasion of immediate sense experience, one cannot simultaneously know the consciousness which is undergoing that experience, because that would be an act of mind. What knowing eye consciousness would be itself an act of mind consciousness, and you can't have mind consciousness and eye consciousness present simultaneously. Okay, so these other types of consciousness have to be known reflectively, but it doesn't mean that it's an interpretation, because one knows through reflection that one was immediately seeing something or immediately hearing something.
But isn't that just kind of an idea? Oh, I have eye consciousness. I mean, there are colors.
Yeah.
And then there's the thought, I have eye consciousness. I mean, how do you know that there's such a thing as consciousness which is separate from the colors themselves?
I would say that Buddhism takes it as axiomatic that the knowing or experiencing itself is the act of consciousness. So if there were just colors, then there's no knowing of the colors, because colors can't know themselves.
Okay, so but the knowing of the color, isn't that mind consciousness?
Well, it would be an act of mind consciousness which knows the color in the sense of identifies the color. Right. The eye consciousness just has the function of purely experiencing the bare immediacy of the color in its bare immediacy. But that which sort of determines the color and classifies the color and conceptualizes the color would be mind consciousness. Okay, Dina?
Bhante, two questions. One, Vibhanga and Bhavanga.
What?
The Bhavanga. Remember in Abhidhamma,
yeah.
right? Bhavanga, Javana.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
Yeah,
the
no, that's
thought.
Correct. Yeah, actually very good, yeah.
And Vibhanga.
No relation at all.
No relation.
No.
Okay. Second question, thank you, is I notice that if you can't smell and you can't taste,
Yeah.
those are kind of early symptoms of Alzheimer's, right? So I'm wondering, you know, when you're missing some of these abilities to see, to smell, or hear, I'm sorry, I'm lost in my ability to frame the question, but
Anyway, you could.
what happens then to these 18? You know, what happens to your consciousness? Clearly it alters. Clearly a sign that it's altering is you can't smell, you can't
Well,
taste.
let's just take the case of somebody who goes blind.
Yeah.
Okay, probably in Buddhist terminology, one would say that their sensitive matter of the eye has been damaged, so that even though the eye organ remains intact, but once the sensitive matter of the eye has been damaged, or we would say that there's been maybe some damage to the retina or to the ocular nerve, then there's no arising of eye consciousness.
And that's okay. I mean, that doesn't distort this.
I mean, the 18 elements are speaking about let's say, the totality of possibilities of experience. It doesn't exclude the possibility.
Okay, thank you. That helped me a lot. Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Okay. I only want questions that actually need clarification about these points rather than questions that are somewhat off tangent. Yeah, please.
Well, it was in regards to what you just said in, well, it's based on a sutta, actually. It said some of our references are based on past. So even though we lose our sight now,
Yeah.
we can still remember what we heard or saw.
Oh, of course.
So
Yeah. But that would be purely activity of mind consciousness, probably dhammas, which would be like visual image. Dhammas could probably include visual images, memories of sounds, memories of odors, tastes, tactile sensations, which are, in this case, being apprehended by mind consciousness.
So we're still generating karma based on or mental activity.
Yeah, I don't want to bring karma in because at this point we're not concerned with karma. Okay, so let's move on then to the next topic. Okay, actually there's a progression taking place here. You could see it. Like now we have the 6 internal sense bases, external sense bases, consciousness, and now the next topic that's introduced are the 6 classes of contact. This is, in Pali, phassa. And in the suttas, phassa is always explained, or usually explained, as the coming together of 3 things. It uses the word sangati. Literally, it's going together. Say coming together, concurrence, encounter of 3 things. That is the object, the sense door, and the corresponding consciousness. So what is, the text would run, independence upon the I and forms, there arises I consciousness. The coming together of the 3 is contact. For example, we get this, I remember it in Sutta number 18. on page 203, paragraph 16. Okay, dependent on the I in forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. Then we'll take the next sentence because that leads into the next section here. When with contact as condition, there is feeling. Okay, so the texts, the suttas speak about contact as simply the coming together of these three particular factors. But I think a little more detail is necessary, or at least helpful. That what I see contact to be, it's not simply that, like you're preparing an omelet, you put some egg, let's say, the way I used to prepare an omelet, you crack some eggs, put them in a bowl, and you cut up some mushrooms, put them in, cut up a piece of onion and put it in, cut up some green pepper and put it in, and mix it all together, then put it on the frying pan. Contact isn't a mixture like that, or it's not like a mixture of, you want to make green paint and you take a little blue paint, mix a little red in, blue paint, yellow paint, and then you don't like that shade of green, you wanted a brighter shade of green, you mix in a little red. It's not a coming together like that, but rather, since we're speaking about doors, objects, and consciousness, so the way I understand contact to be the encounter of consciousness with the object through the sense door, through the sense faculty. If we take the image of the door, the metaphor of the door, then consciousness goes out through the eye door to encounter forms. And when consciousness encounters forms through the eye door, that encounter is contact. Or reversing the image, when forms come in through the eye door, so that consciousness can get in touch with those forms, can know those forms, that initial encounter is contact. And so contact is a specific mental event. It's not merely the impingement of the sense object on the sense faculty. For example, many forms are sort of streaming in and impinging on the eye, but unless my consciousness goes to those forms and knows those forms in some way, there's no contact with those forms. Somebody might be calling my name in the distance, but I'm walking by. There might be the impingement of the sound, so I just take it to be, I don't even pay any attention to that sound. There's no contact. But when the consciousness goes out and actually, in a sense, touches that object, that is the event of contact. And so we then have 6 types of contact depending upon the sense base through which it occurs. Okay, now, you see in the passage I was reading earlier, it says, with dependent upon contact, there arises feeling. And now it seems to me that the Buddha is actually treating feeling here in the next section in a rather indirect but rather interesting and almost in an interesting way, which seems to be unique to this particular sutta. I don't recur this type of passage occurring in any other sutta, and that is in terms of what I've called, or what we've translated as, mental exploration. The Pali word here is mano. Manupa vichara. And if any of you are familiar with Pali terminology, you know that vichara is one of the, we come across the word vichara in the standard jhana formulas as one of the factors that is present in the first jhana, or that's the factors that are used to develop jhana. So vichara has the sense of examination. And the commentary explains that here upavichara implies sort of the mutual or the collaborative functioning of vichara with vitakka. Vitakka is its sort of the twin, or maybe the older brother or sister of vichara. So the two often go together. So vitakka is the application of the mind to the object, and vichara is the examination of the object. And here it's called mano upavichara, because these are explorations that are done by the mind. And the text is speaking here about 18 kinds of mental exploration. And when we go through them, we could see why I said that this is an indirect way of introducing feeling into the discussion. Okay, so let's just go through them, and I've put them out schematically on the handout. So on seeing a form with the eye, okay, first there arises, based on the form and eye consciousness, the coming together of the three is eye contact. And now one explores a form productive of joy. One explores a form productive of, I don't like the word grief here, it's domanassa, which is mental displeasure. It could be sadness, sorrow, any degree of dejection, unhappiness, any kind of mental displeasure. And one explores a form productive of equanimity. Okay, then the same sort of threefold distinction is made with each of the other sense bases. Okay, till we come to on knowing a mind object with the mind. One explores a mind object productive of joy. One explores a mind object productive of displeasure. One explores a mind object productive of equanimity. And so we get 18 kinds of mental exploration by taking 6 kinds of exploration with joy, 6 kinds of exploration with grief, and 6 kinds of exploration with equanimity. And if we take this superficially, it seems to be distinguishing that there's one kind of form productive of joy, another kind of form productive of displeasure, another kind of form productive of equanimity. But actually the same object can generate, can belong to the 3 categories depending upon one's own subjective state. For example, we have a young man who has a newly formed girlfriend, a newly acquired girlfriend. Whenever he sees her, he sees her coming in the distance, he'll be looking on the lookout for her. Then he sees her coming in the difference. So then we could say that this is a form, so he's exploring a form productive of joy. Okay, so then this goes on for 6 months or so. Whenever he sees her, joy, joy, joy. You know what's coming next. We'll keep it clean. One day he goes into the city, maybe to buy some things, and he's walking down Broadway or 7th Avenue. A movie theater lets out, and who does he see? Holding hands with another boy. Okay, now he sees her holding hands with another boy, and okay, the form productive of displeasure, maybe grief is appropriate here. And then he calls, a later occasion, he calls her, I want to talk to you. They meet someplace. When he sees her, again, displeasure. Okay, then she says, Ralph, I'm sorry, but we have to break it off. I've met somebody else. Okay, then, okay, the relationship is ended. And occasionally, he'll run across her on the street. Whenever he sees her, form productive of displeasure, sorrow, grief. But time goes on, and, what is the saying? Time is the remedy for all sorrows. Time heals all grief. So he develops indifference to her. And now he sees her arm in arm with the other boy, and a form productive of equanimity. He becomes a monk. He already did. And even the same object, can be productive of joy, productive of sorrow or displeasure, productive of equanimity. Like, okay, when I was a teenager, I would put the rock and roll records on the phonograph, and I would be sort of jumping with joy, listening to them. Then my mother would come home and say, I can't stand that stuff. Can you turn it off? So for her, it's displeasure. Same music. And then my father would come home, and he's completely indifferent to it. Okay, and so this can be applied to any of the 6 sense bases. Of course, other people can perceive our own mental objects, but even a mental object that we might entertain. Can anybody think of anything that can be entertained by oneself? Yeah, I guess ideas can give joy at one occasion. Excuse me? Oh, I thought that's a good example, yeah. Yeah, okay, so sensual lust arises, say if one is a young man out in the world, one would dwell on it and enjoy it and encourage it. If one is striving, say if one has become a renunciant, this is a problem that plagues many monks, is that sensual lust arises sort of uncontrollably, and though one makes efforts to, when it arises, then it can become very disturbing and distressing. But let me just try to finish. But then if one uses like mindfulness when it arises, one can just, examine it and say, okay, sensual lust has arisen. This is impermanent, insubstantial. And then one is observing it with equanimity. Yes, John, I think it is. Please pass the microphone back.
Is that on? So one thing I'm a little bit confused about is your analogy that man is consumed by obsessed with a mind-conscious story. Because when he went and saw, say, the lady with another guy, she may have been dressed beautifully. The eye contact would have been bringing certain kinds of different information, but it sounds like the whole analogy, he's consumed by a story. It's not really what actually the eye is connecting with in a natural, pure form.
Yeah, actually, that's.
So I kind of get a little confused like that. It almost seems like an impossible task then, like to stay with hearing, contact, consciousness in a pure form. What's the difference? Where do you differentiate with pure form and the ability to sustain that and the quality of that, as opposed to be constantly driven by these internal mind stories?
Okay, actually, that's a good point. And sort of I was merging what's a complex situation together just in order to convey the point that the same object can generate joy, displeasure, and equanimity on different occasions. But, I mean, if we just keep it to the level of, without bringing in mental stories, well, I'm not sure that we can do this. It's not so easy to do. Just to the level of looking purely at an object with eye consciousness and the most elementary functions of mind consciousness, looking at a patch, the same patch of red, for example, can it give joy on one occasion, displeasure on another, equanimity on another, apart from bringing one's mood in? And this I don't know. But the point that I was trying to make with these common sense everyday examples is that the capacity to generate joy, displeasure, or an indifferent feeling is not inherent in the object itself. Though, of course, things which are, let's say, presumptively pleasurable or agreeable, like nice sights, beautiful music, delicious tastes, would tend to generate, when they're explored with the mind, will tend to generate joy, and things which are intrinsically or presumptively disagreeable, like ugly forms, harsh sounds, badly prepared food would tend to generate, when it explored with the mind, would tend to generate displeasure, and things that are presumptively neutral would tend to generate indifferent feeling.
So everything is multi-determined in a way.
Oh yeah, of course. Edwin, yeah. And take the microphone, which will be passed down.
Yeah. Well, in practicing mindfulness of of the body, of actually actually practicing the 32 parts, it would be more an antidote to what used to be your happiness or joy, but now when you're practicing it, there's this pleasure because you're trying to fight. It's more like a conflict, and therefore you cannot succeed. When you come out of your meditation, you still feel lost, and you're fighting this joy and this pleasure. Yeah. Would that be more of a form of what we're studying here, more or less, fighting that joy with an antidote to get rid of it so that you can find joy? In reality, the loss itself was a joy, but you're looking for further joy, which is the equanimity. Yeah. Right? Is that right? Yeah. The 32 parts, when you're practicing.
Yeah. But I think you're jumping ahead into
Oh,
material that will come later in the sutta.
Okay.
I don't think we'll get to it today. Actually, I want to backtrack just to the question that, or the point that you brought up. Now, I think if one looks at the terminology in the sutta, that it speaks about mental explorations, so it's not speaking about things that are occurring at the level of what we might call a rudimentary level of consciousness, the bare level of visual, of eye consciousness, ear consciousness. But this is the way one explores with the mind the forms, sounds, odors. So naturally, one is going to be bringing in one's value system, one's background stories, one's past mental impressions in the way one explores that object.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to the next section of the sutta. And now it starts to get pretty complicated. And again, this passage seems to me to be unique to this sutta. Let me just, before I go into this one, let me just stay with the 18 types of mental exploration. I said that this introduces feeling here, and the reason why feeling is introduced here is that we have here, as sort of the basis of the discussion, 3 types of feeling, which are called here joy, displeasure, and equanimity. So joy, let me use the Pali words, which are exact. Yeah, these 3 terms come in a 5-fold distinction of types of feeling, in which joy, or somanassa, is said to be mental pleasure as distinct from bodily pleasure. And domanassa is said to be mental pain, or dejection, or displeasure, as opposed to dukkha, which is used in the narrow sense of bodily pain. And then upekkha here has the sense of equanimous feeling, neutral feeling, feeling that's neither pleasant nor painful. Okay, so now in the next section, the 36 positions of beings starts to elaborate upon this, using as the starting point or basis this 3-fold distinction amongst types of feelings. So we start with joy. This is called the 36 positions of beings, which is a very tentative translation. Or it could even be rendered states of beings. Okay, so distinctions are made that there are 6 kinds of joy based on the household life, or based on, you say, on the worldly life, and 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation. And here the distinction, as we'll see, of household life and renunciation is not referring to the distinction of a lay person and a monastic, but it's rather, I would call it the distinction of subjective orientation, whether one is becoming engrossed and sort of entangled and involved in these types of feelings and experiences, or whether one is moving in the direction of detachment from them. So we have 6 kinds of joy based on the worldly life, 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation, 6 kinds of grief or displeasure based on the household life, 6 kinds of displeasure based on renunciation, 6 kinds of equanimity based on the worldly life, 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation. So that is sort of setting up the template or outline. Now we're going to come to the elaboration of them. Okay, so the text continues. What are the 6 kinds of joy based on the household life? And again, now as before, the text, the elaboration is going to proceed through each of the sense channels. So we have, when one regards as a gain, the gain of forms cognizable by the eye that are wished for, desired, agreeable, gratifying, and associated with worldliness, or when one recalls what was formerly obtained that is past, seized, and changed, joy arises. So this joy is called joy based on the household life. And then in my outline, I just sort of grouped all of this complex explanation together very simply under the heading of simply the joy at gaining forms, desirable, agreeable forms. Okay, then the same formula is applied to each of the other sense bases. So we have it through sounds, odors, flavors, tactile objects. And it's a little bit, well, it seems a little bit strange to speak of the gain of mental objects. Maybe we could think of like gaining mental objects that are wished for, desired, agreeable, gratifying, and associated with worldliness. Can anybody think of examples of that? I just want to get an example of the gain of mind objects cognizable by the mind that are wished for, desired, agreeable.
Square root of 4 is 2 or minus 2. I gain 2 things. 2 and minus 2 is gained from my mind based on the question.
But what's agreeable and...
Agreeable is...
Anyway. Oh, yeah, maybe that's a good example. Okay. Suki.
How about thinking of eating some good food later? And
well, that's, of course, you could say that that's a mind object, but I want to see whether there's any examples of a non-sensory mind objects.
I mean, not just thinking about it?
Well, I said when one is thinking about it, it is, technically it's a mind object, but it's one which has a sensory origin. I'm trying to get non-sensory examples. Stephen? Actually, that's a good example. Yeah. Well, I think that is coming now because this is described as connected with worldliness, or literally is connected with the household life, whereas the meditative states would now be coming in the direction of, as we'll see, with those would be the states that are connected with the opposite, with renunciation. Chris?
Maybe it's kind of sensory, but social status.
Actually, that's
Yeah.
also a good example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily sensory. That could be an example, yeah. No, I don't want to have any square roots. No square roots. I want real... Too many words. I just want simple examples. I would say that this is on the side of renunciation rather than the household life. Okay, as you were speaking, a few other examples came to my mind. Bhante, you gave such an interesting class today. I learned so much. Okay, the head is spinning, thinking, wow, praise. And then yeah, usually we have the classification. What are those? Gain. So I bought some new stock and I open the stock market pages and I see, wow, it's jumping, just jumping higher and higher and higher. So gain. Yeah, material gain. Then praise. Then fame. You know, we have all the movie stars, rock stars, sports stars. You know, the head is sort of filled with intoxication with fame. Okay, so we have some examples. Okay, so these are the gains that are things that are wished for, desirable, agreeable, gratifying, and associated with worldliness. Now we come to 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation. So this is one type of example here, but this is, well, relating to forms. So when, by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees as it actually is with proper wisdom that forms, both formally and in the past, are all impermanent, suffering, and subject to change, joy arises. Such joy as this is called the joy based on renunciation. Then the commentary just, well, it explains that this is the joy that arises when one has set up insight and is watching the breakup of formations with a current of sharp and bright insight knowledge focused on formations. The word formations here refers to all conditioned phenomena. So this is the case of somebody who's not just reflecting on impermanence, but is actually seeing with direct insight the breaking up and passing away of forms. Okay, so this is the joy of insight based on forms, and then the same thing is repeated for sounds, odors, tastes, and mental objects. Here it's pretty clear with mind objects. If one is contemplating, any kind of objects of the mind arise, they're just present momentarily, then they pass away and perish. That is the insight into the impermanent nature of dhammas or mind objects. So based on that insight, there arises this piti and somanassa, delight and joy. So these are called the kinds of joy, 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation. Okay, then we have 6 kinds of displeasure or sorrow based on the household life. It's expressed in a rather complicated way. When one regards as a non-gain the non-gain of forms cognizable by the eye that are wished for and so forth, or when one recalls what was formerly not obtained, that has passed, seized, and changed, displeasure arises. This is called displeasure based on the household life. Let's see if we could sort of decipher this, put it in simpler, more natural language. Okay, in the outline I said that this is sadness at not gaining forms, but the text has one regards as a non-gain, the non-gain of forms. So if I don't get some forms, sounds, odors, things that might be considered desirable, but I don't think of it as that I'm missing out on anything, then it doesn't cause displeasure or sorrow to arise. So I see other people going out, to nightclubs and going out on the town and going to parties, but I have no interest in those things, so I don't consider it to be any kind of lack on my part. But somebody who is keen on getting invitations to parties and going out to nightclubs and nobody invites them, then they think of it, that I'm missing out on something, and so that causes displeasure to arise. Anybody else have any ideas about this? Or, for example, with regard to taste, people like to go out, today I have to go out to at least one week I have to go out to an Italian restaurant. I don't like to eat the same thing. I want to go out now this week to a Indian restaurant, this week to a Turkish restaurant, next week to Ethiopian restaurant. Don't suggest Chinese restaurant to me, young. Well, I think, I don't know if I've mentioned this in class, when I was in in Sri Lanka, occasionally I'm a human being, I have weak spots, dream of finding myself in New York's Chinatown with a whole range of Chinese restaurants and wondering which one should I go to, and then wake up and what's on the menu for today? Same old Sri Lankan curries. Now, when somebody says to me, would you like to go out to a Chinese restaurant? Okay, but seriously, if one doesn't get something that's considered desirable through the senses, and one considers it to be a loss or a lack, then displeasure arises. Okay, but so those are 6 kinds of displeasure based on the household life. Now the interesting one are the 6 kinds of displeasure based on renunciation. Of course, you think that somebody who is living the life of renunciation is living a peaceful or blissful life, but there's also a specific, of course, there can be somebody who's living the life of renunciation, particularly, this happens in Asian countries where young boys are, just before I pass on to this, just before I pass on to this, I have to say to Siu and his mom, when I spoke about the same old Sri Lankan curries, don't be discouraged. What I mean is that when you get the same thing every day, it becomes boring. But when I see you tell me that I'll be bringing kiribat and my mother will be making some Sri Lankan curries, then I say, bring it on. No, I was speaking about, no, what I meant to say is that monks who have entered on and nuns who have entered on the life of renunciation could still have the grief, but that would be the grief or displeasure based on the worldly life if they start thinking, oh, I'm missing out on all of those delightful worldly enjoyments. But this is a specific kind of displeasure actually related to renunciation. Okay, so this is the case. They use the case of forms as the example. By knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees it actually as it is with proper wisdom, that it's all impermanent. And then one gives rise to a longing for the supreme liberations thus. When shall I enter upon and abide in that base? I think the Pali actually uses the word ayatana here. That base that the noble ones now enter upon and abide in. And the commentary explains both those liberations, those supreme liberations, and the base as being arahatship. But since it uses supreme or unsurpassed liberations in the plural, maybe the commentary is being too narrow in just identifying it with arhatship. But it can mean maybe the attainment of, the jhanas and the formless meditations, or the attainment of the higher stages of insight, and up to the lower paths and fruits, culminating in arhatship as the final attainment. The text is open-ended in that respect. It's not very specific. Okay, but when one generates this longing for some higher attainment, higher realization, but one isn't able to obtain it, then there arises a kind of maybe a sadness, a sorrow, a disappointment. And that is called again, grief is too strong, but the displeasure or sadness based on renunciation. And then the same thing is extended to sounds, odors, tastes, and so on. Okay, I think we'll have to stop here, and I'll just ask whether there are any questions on points that need immediate clarification. And then we'll pick up next week, starting with section 14. Any questions? Anything needing clarification or comments? Okay, we'll come back after the lunch period, let's say 12:15. We could have some further discussion and questions and answers after lunch. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so we are going to share the merits with the devas, the deities, the bhutas, the fierce spirits, the nagas, the dragon spirits, and with all beings. Oh, you want to hand them out? I think everybody knows them already. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Short way. Sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagupadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanino tukha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, so we end with 3 bows to the Buddha. Today is 15th. Yeah, we do have the class next week. Okay, 3 bows to the Buddha. Half bows. Okay, any questions?
I have the mic.
Any questions?
Bhante, where does Cetasika mental formations fall into this? Do we see the form, or the base is open, we see the form? How does this...
Where do the mental factors fit in?
Right.
This sutta doesn't specifically mention the mental factors, but we could understand, of course, feeling is one mental factor. And then in what's called mental exploration, vitaka and vichara, applied thought and sustained thought, or thought and examination, those would be mental factors. And so, of course, the mental factors are there, but this isn't, in that respect, this isn't an Abhidhamma text which is concerned with analyzing mental factors and classifying them. So the mental factors are sort of left a little bit on the sidelines as a particular class. There's somebody else?
One other question before. And you talked, one of the doors or the basis would be,
I think it's
one of the bases would be consciousness. One of the objects is consciousness, but how does consciousness reference or observe consciousness? Can you talk a little bit about that?
This was a point of, again, this issue isn't brought up directly for discussion in the suttas, though the Buddha speaks, for example, about mindfulness of the mind. So citta is one of the objects of mindfulness in the 4 foundations of mindfulness. But the issue isn't brought up, or that type of question doesn't come up in the suttas themselves. And so it became a bit of like a point of controversy and different opinions amongst the different schools of Buddhism. So according to, the Theravada Abhidhamma system, with commentaries, and probably most of the mainstream schools, even the Madhyamaka school, says that it's impossible for one state of consciousness to observe itself while it's occurring simultaneously. So what is taking place And then they use the example, it's just as it's impossible for a finger to touch itself, or it's impossible for a knife to cut itself. So one state of consciousness cannot know itself as it's actually occurring. So when it seems that we're observing the mind, what is actually occurring at sort of the microscopic level is that there's a rapid succession of processes of consciousness. And so the state of consciousness which is doing the observation is a later state of consciousness, but still in close proximity to the earlier state of consciousness that was observing a particular a sense object or undergoing a particular emotion. And so, for example, in the Satipatthana Sutta, when it said, when the mind has lust, one knows the mind has lust. Okay, so the mind that's observing there is lust is not that state of mind that's doing the observing or that's exercising the mindfulness is not actually the state of mind with the lust, but it's following sort of in the shadow or trail of that, so that, they seem to be simultaneous, but there's actually a very brief temporal difference between the two. So this was sort of what I call the mainstream Buddhist position. But then there was another school I think this was the school of Dignaga and Dharmakirti. It's called like the logical school. They came up with the idea, it's called Svadvedana, which means Sva is self, Vedana experiencing, that every consciousness also experiences itself at the same time that it's having the experience of an object. And this is said to be the basis for, I think, this is supposed to be a general question and answer period rather than of course, if we want to have a panel discussion, Samudin in dialogue with Bhikkhu Bodhi. Richard had something to say. Oh wait, Stephen, did you have a question? Yeah, you have the mic. Let you. I don't think the microphone has worked. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
I have a question about the 6 kinds of grief based on renunciation.
Yeah.
Are these to be looked at as positive things? Because I wonder if this sort of points to a little bit about the wanting of enlightenment or the wanting of some sort of attainment, which of course leads to a sense of lack while you're wanting it.
Yeah. Again, it's an interesting question for discussion. Technically, in the Abhidhamma, domanassa is said to be the basis always for unwholesome states of consciousness. And in this case, the domanassa arises from wanting something that one hasn't obtained or feeling disappointed for one's failure to obtain something. So in that sense, technically it would be have to be classified as unwholesome, but in a sense it's a push in the it's an unwholesome which is pushing in the wholesome direction. So it's a kind of beneficial thing, and I believe, if I remember what I read last night, and what we didn't get, we'll come to next week, is that it said that depending upon the 6 folds, here I have sorrow or displeasure based on renunciation, abandon the 6-fold sorrow based on the household life. So even though this sorrow or displeasure for failing to get what one obtains might be called unwholesome technically, but it's can be viewed positively because it's removing one from the sorrow based upon worldly desire towards the desire for spiritual realizations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we can pass down to Richard.
Yeah, it strikes me that the first Abhidhamma school, right, has an assumption that you can only be conscious of one thing at a time, but
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to be stating the basis of that assumption.
Yeah.
It strikes me it's really a kind of you can't walk and chew gum at the same time school, right? And and then the second school says, well, you can't, says you can walk and know you're walking at the same time.
Yeah.
But it's not really saying you can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? It seems to me that there's plenty of evidence that you can do at least three things at once. That is, you can walk and chew gum and know that you're walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? I mean, I don't see any problem myself with believing that I know what's in my visual field
Yeah.
at the same time that I'm hearing something, right? And that I may be hearing something
Wait,
that has nothing.
wait just a second. My
Okay.
attention was deflected by, and I can't listen to two sounds at the same time.
But then how do you listen to a symphony?
Yeah, you mean with so many instruments playing at the same time?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you may have 100 instruments in a symphony.
It's one
You
massive
can't hear them
sound.
all separately, but you certainly can hear them. Mozart, he'd go to a concert when he was 5 years old. He'd come back and he'd write down every note. Sometimes when there are like 8 parts going at once, he remembered them all distinctly. Right? So how do you describe Mozart's consciousness?
Yeah.
Then
I have to say, it seems to me that this scholastic or Abhidhammic way of treating consciousness is an oversimplification. I believe that the mind is really like there's a name for these kind of computer parallel, is that what they call it? Parallel processes?
Oh, okay.
Johnny is in the computer field. Yeah, so that it can actually really process several things going on at the same time. But what they would say, I'm taking the standpoint of, the strict Abhidhammika about your walking and chewing gum. And both actions are formed by intention, by volition. So, because when you're chewing gum, each time you're making an intentional effort to chew down on the ball of gum. And also, as you're walking, you're making an intentional effort to take each step. So what they would say is that if you put the mind series under a psychic microscope, you'll see that there are alternating or altering thought processes. With one thought process, one is making the determination, squeeze down on the gum. With another thought process occurring a few microseconds after, you're having the volition lift the right foot. Then another volitional process, relax the jaws on the gum. Another volitional process, bring the right foot forward.
But that doesn't explain how you are able to track each of them. It just makes an added complication, because if the events have to be discrete and separate, then you have to explain how you're able to get from one event in your jaw to the next event in your jaw when it's interfered with by the event with your foot.
Yeah.
Right? Which just seems to make it more complex.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, as I said, that it seems to me that this perspective on the mind as being able to exercise only one volition at any moment is an oversimplification of what
But that's not a question of consciousness. That's a question of volition. For instance, what if your stomach is growling at the same time, because your peristaltic processes is getting noisy? Well, that's not volitional, and yet you can notice it.
Okay.
Right? And so consciousness has to be distinct from volition.
I use volition, but I would apply the same thing to consciousness. Like I'm seeing you and hearing you at the same time. Of course, again, the Abhidhammica would say that what's going on at the microscopic level is that there are, very, very evanescent process by which I see your image, then in almost immediate succession, another process by which I hear your voice.
Yeah, but that's an inference. It's not an observation.
Yeah.
That is, it's an inference, and it's an inference without the stated assumptions.
Yeah. I mean, I admit that. Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah, Boe had a question.
Bhante, I have a question about paragraph 8. Just that sentence, when seeing a form with the eye, one explores a form productive of joy and so forth. But before I ask my question, I need to say something about the first several classes of my English grammar class. Our English grammar told us when she explains the difference between definite article and indefinite article, she said, if I say once upon a time there is a king, and then the second time you would say the king, THE. So I wonder, the first form is the same as the second form. Otherwise, we would say, when seeing a form with the eye, one explores the form, THE. So is the second form the pretty girl, or is the second form, does the second form refer to the person who is observing? Otherwise, how come the second form starts with A? So it's one form and not exactly the same person, the same form.
One seeing a form with the eye.
Right. And
on seeing a form with the eye, one explores a form productive of joy.
So what does the second form refer to? Is the same as the first one, or the?
The form productive of joy is the form that one is seeing with the eye.
So how come it's not the form? Like we say, once upon a time there is a king, and the king does this, did this and that. So the second form, could it be possible the person who is observing? So otherwise, what's the purpose of observing another person's form all the time? Basically, it's about the practitioner himself or herself. So if the second form is the practitioner himself, no, it's not possible.
It's speaking about an external object. Okay, so when on seeing a form, let's just make it very simple. On seeing a patch of grass, or the green of a patch of grass. Okay, on seeing a form with the eye, one explores a form productive of joy. So the form that's productive of joy is the patch of green grass that I'm seeing with the eye. It's not referring to anything else.
It cannot be the form, the physical form of the practitioner, which is generated by his mind.
No. It's the form that's the object of the eye.
How come it's not the form?
Not the form.
THE, the second form. Why is not like?
Well, the Pali doesn't use pronouns, and Yeah, it's just you has rupang without any pronoun. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's just describing a very general case. Okay, Tracy?
This might be beyond today's discussion, but I'm wondering about the transition from householder to renunciate. Like, how does renunciation arise? It seems like we're so conditioned.
Yeah.
And yet there has to be a space where renunciation can appear. Does this model offer insight about that?
Yeah. I mean, what you say is true, but, the sutta isn't concerned with that process here, but it's really just setting up sort of a contrast or a dichotomy in order to show, the difference in the distinctive quality of the joy, displeasure, equanimity associated with called worldliness, or with worldly attachment, and the joy, sorrow, displeasure, equanimity connected with renunciation or with liberation. But there are other suttas which deal with, many other suttas with making the transition from one to the other. Did you have Edwin?
Yeah.
And then Allison.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, actually, I'm going further into the chapter, but this is based on depending on this, abandon that. In other words, if you depend on that, then you abandon that. Isn't that what is getting to the final of chapter? We haven't got there yet, but that's why there's the confusion. That we have to, by depending on this, you abandon that.
Yeah.
So therefore, is what he's saying is if you depend on one thing, right, which is equanimity, actually the household, then you abandon that. Equanimity goes into the meditative state.
Yeah.
Isn't that would be answering this? The 36 positions of beings, would it be?
Are you presenting this as an answer to Tracy's question? Or?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that maybe that's where the confusion comes in, that the end of the chapter is explaining the 36 of positions of beings is actually depending on this, abandon that. So it's going back into saying by depending on this equanimity, you let go of household life, and then you go into renunciation.
Let me just take another look. There is, in the next part of the sutta, a process of a process of refinement, of moving from, of making a transition from one to the other, though the sutta itself doesn't explain the steps by which one makes that transition. I think, and she was asking about the steps or process by which one makes that transition.
Okay.
Because there's still, depending on the sixfold joy based on renunciation, abandon the sixfold joy based on the household life.
Right, so
actually, maybe you could even see that as a way of making that transition. Though it's not explored in any detail, but if one draws out the full implications.
Mm-hmm.
And then Allison had a question, then Sam, then Paul.
Bhante, would you not think that, breaking these into the householder and the renunciate is a little redundant, because the underlying joy, displeasure, and indifference are the three states, and a person who's a householder and can get to that state is not as good as a renunciate who is at that state?
Did you come a little bit late?
I did, probably, yeah.
Yeah. What I explained when I introduce these terms is that even though it uses the term the household life, or the literally is gehanisita, depending upon the home or the house, and then that's contrasted with renunciation. I said that we shouldn't interpret this in terms of the polarity of the householder or layperson versus the monk or monastic, but sort of these are just maybe figures of speech indicating that which is on the side of attachment or bondage to the worldly life, and that which is on the side of detachment, renunciation, the move in the direction of liberation. So it's not sort of necessarily tying these to conceptions of particular individual types of persons, but it's using this as sort of general categories to indicate the nature of this joy, displeasure, and equanimity.
Right, thanks.
Okay, we were moving.
Hi, Bhante, I have a question regarding to the contact you're talking about. I'd like to have a clear definition. When you say contact, in order to have a contact formed, had to have a sangati, three things together.
Yeah.
Okay. And you said object, sense door, and in verbally you said corresponding consciousness.
Yeah.
And in page 203, it says the example is use I, and you say I consciousness.
Yeah.
And so I have two questions regarding to this definition of a contact. One is, in each of these three, does one person have to be, what role is playing? Is it active role, active to look for the object, or is it not active to look for the object? Each of these three things. And corresponding consciousness, I want to know is only corresponding to the object and the sense. In other words, if the object is I consciousness, if it's only corresponding to the I consciousness, then what's the next step to create the feelings? So I'm thinking about, I want definition. When you corresponding consciousness, are you talking about singular consciousness or a stream of consciousness after that three together? I hope I asked the question clearly.
Okay, the first question was, when you're speaking about the arising of eye consciousness or eye contact, is this something which happens to one in a passive role, or in the case where one is actively seeking the particular object? That's the question?
Yes, I'd like to know whether it's actively looking for an object.
Yeah.
And if it's yes, then...
Wait, first, let me answer that question. The text doesn't specify. So we could take it probably that it's speaking about the case where this happens to the person in a relatively passive role, where some object impinges upon the sense faculty and initiates the process of cognition. But it can also apply to a case where one actively seeks something. But the most basic level is where one is the passive recipient of the experience. Okay, the second question now was?
Can I follow the answer of your first question? Okay, then it's okay. The second question.
To come up and
no. The second question is
you've knocked out Sam, and now a dot.
The second question is when you are explaining to us, is coming together. The three things have to come together. You use these two words. You use these two words. Use corresponding consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay. in page 203,
yeah,
you use example. You say I
yeah,
and form
yeah,
and I consciousness.
yeah,
But here is a singular consciousness,
yeah,
right? But in order, my mind, the way I process, in order for me to see an object,
yeah,
and go to the sense door and to go to eye consciousness, the next thing for me to create the feelings, I definitely have another consciousness is to like or dislike.
Okay.
And then creates the feeling. So I wonder the corresponding consciousness, is that a stream of consciousness or just a singular?
Okay, I understand. Okay, when I use the term corresponding consciousness, what I mean is that in the case of a visible the eye in visible form, there is the eye consciousness. Then I said, and so for the corresponding types of consciousness, that is when there's an ear, a sound in the ear, then it'll be ear consciousness, nose and smell, nose and an odor, nose consciousness, and so on. So what I mean is that the consciousness corresponds to the object and the sense door. Okay, then your point that when you experience the form that occurs on one occasion, then it takes the process goes on for some time, then you have the feeling, and then after that you have what? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
From the contact to next stage of feelings.
Okay.
It's not just only it's not just simply the three together.
Yeah. Okay.
And then creates a feeling.
I understood. Okay, now I think we could say this even from the suttas, certainly from the Abhidhamma, one would say that on the occasion when the barest, simplest eye consciousness takes place, there is, along with the consciousness, there's the contact. Along with that contact, simultaneously, there's the feeling, there's a perception, there's some volition. So those are all occurring simultaneously. But it might be that because the sight of the object, the perception of the object is more prominent at the very beginning, so the feeling might be somewhat subdued and lying in the background, so that you're not distinctly aware of the feeling that you're experiencing when you're seeing the form. And then it seems that the feeling first appears maybe a little bit later as you're continuing to look at the form or reflecting on it. But what's happening is that there are a succession of processes of consciousness, and in later ones, the feeling is becoming more prominent. And so now you become clearly aware of the feeling, but the feeling was present already from the start. It's just that the feeling sort of gains momentum. Wait, let me continue. Okay, then maybe based upon that feeling, then at a later occasion, you explore or investigate the form that's the basis for that feeling.
So the feeling comes later, but you mentioned it. The consciousness, all the things that happen simultaneously.
Right. The feeling becomes prominent later, but the feeling is already present from the start, from the first moment of consciousness.
So it looked like
and the
latent.
Excuse me?
It looked like latent, but it will show up later.
Yeah, and the feeling can actually change. Like at the initial moment of sensory awareness or sensory consciousness, the feeling could be neutral because you're not at that point distinctly aware of what you're seeing. But as you focus in and recognize it or dwell upon it, then maybe either a joyful feeling or a feeling of displeasure will arise and displace that neutral feeling.
Thank you.
Hi. A little bit related to her question. I'm just curious, when does the subjective experience of something happen? So,
say again.
When does the subjective experience of something happen? So, is contact is the coming together, say, of, you know, for instance, eye consciousness, the object, and what is the third thing?
The sense faculty.
Oh, the sense faculty, right. So, at the moment of contact, is there the subjective experience of, say, the color blue?
Excuse me?
At the moment of contact, does the subjective experience of, say, the color blue arise?
Okay. At the
Okay.
moment of contact,
Okay.
which is the moment of consciousness, there'll be the cognizing, the consciousness, say, in your case, of a blue objective field.
Which is I'm a little bit confused, though, when you say the moment of consciousness. Because contact supposedly is the coming together of consciousness, which already existed.
Well, actually, this is an interesting point. The text seems to be saying that consciousness is there before contact takes place.
Right.
But actually, you know, looking at it in terms of conditionality, when consciousness arises, contact is present. You know, there's no case of consciousness existing prior to contact, but the two are called mutuality conditions or reciprocity conditions. The two are supporting each other from the start.
Okay. I thought maybe consciousness was the capacity to have subjective experience, but
no, here it's being used in the sense of the actual knowing,
the
experiencing
itself.
of an object.
Okay. All right, thanks.
If you think you want to share it with the group, you can.
About the sequence. In imaginative experience, there are a lot of different possible sequences. You can have a feeling first and then attach an image to it.
Yeah.
Right? You could have a thought first and then attach a feeling or an image. You could have a concept or a volition. That is, when you imaginatively, you rearrange those sequences in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, I mean, that I know.
Yeah. I mean, that's all.
Yeah, I just used one particular example, but there are all sorts of interrelationships possible between them.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, Sam, and then we'll have to call it quits unless somebody has a really urgent, irresistible question or comment.
Before you were talking about the mind can only process one of the objects or from the doors or the bases at a time. But that was quite evident because when the alarm went off, you stopped listening to Richard.
No, but I was hearing both at the same time initially.
Yeah, but hearing and listening are two different things.
Sort of, because of my concern, maybe there's a fire someplace. It seemed to be a fire alarm. So I was thinking maybe there's a fire taking place. So it's just that my concern sort of pushed my attention to Rich's remarks out. It's not that I wasn't capable of hearing the two simultaneously.
Priority comes into play somewhere along with the consciousness too, safety or whatever, self-preservation.
Yeah, of course.
But walking and chewing gum, even when we slow it down and we do walking meditation, if you pay attention to the foot as it's lifting, you can pay attention to the breath at the same time and so on and so forth. It has to be one. I don't see how it could possibly be. It's happening at milliseconds. So there's no way to process something cognitively or lucidly if we're processing it all at the same time, concurrently.
This I'm not so sure. You know, sort of the orthodox position, as I said, is that one could only, again, it's easier to state this in terms of volition rather than knowing. So the traditional or orthodox position is that one volition at a time, and so when one is chewing down on the gum, One cannot be lifting the foot. When one is lifting the foot, one cannot be pressing down or relaxing the jaw to chew the gum. And I mean, what one notices if one is, doing very intensive mindfulness meditation, we actually practice like breaking a step down and, to 6 or to 8 phases so that you could see in each step that you're lifting, bringing the foot up to lifting the foot, bringing it forward to the point where it's equal with the other foot, and extending the foot in front, putting it down, pressing it down. And so one is breaking the step down into these places. And when you're doing it with mindfulness, then you see that you're exercising each volition separately. But maybe this is because one is adopting this particular pose or particular method of mindfulness. And so for this reason, one is exercising each volition separately. But I took a walk this morning, and if you ask me how many volitions was I aware of?
But that's exactly it too, Bhante. There's voluntary and involuntary. We don't tell ourselves to breathe, or we're not even conscious that we're breathing or walking.
Yeah, of course. Well, breathing occurs without any volitional effort at all, but it would seem that each step that I take is the function of a choice that I make to take that step. And if it's a function of a choice, then there has to be a volition behind it.
One last thing. How can you have consciousness first or concurrently if there's nothing to refer to? You can't have consciousness without cause or condition, right?
Whoever said that there's consciousness without cause or condition?
What is there to reference? How can I know something is red if I've never seen red before?
I don't understand the question.
How can we have knowledge, consciousness, mind, if we don't have anything to reference back to?
Yeah, I understand the question, but I don't quite understand the relevance. Let me take Richard's question, then we'll stop for the day.
There are people who specialize in these things, like there are jazz musicians who play in 13/17 time.
Who play in?
13/17 time, meaning 13 beats with the left hand, while the right hand is doing 17 beats, so that it keeps on, so that the relationship just keeps on changing. There are people you can watch drummers who are using their one with their right hand, one with the left hand, and then same with both feet. I mean, this is many people's profession. And it's something that people train themselves in, and they can, there are lots of people who do all kinds of extraordinary things like that.
Not only that, but there's a creature. I saw it in Sri Lanka. I don't know whether we have it in it. Well, we have centipedes in this country with 1,000 legs.
Yeah, right.
In Sri Lanka, there's one called the millipede, which has 1,000 legs.
Yes.
I don't know whether it's literal or just.
No, it just means more than 100.
Number. But it might have several hundred legs.
The centipedes are more poisonous than the millipedes.
Yeah, the millipedes are not poisonous at all. But if I teach that poor millipede to be mindful of walking.
I think there's a Lewis Carroll poem like that, right? But the thing is, it seems to me that with things like that, it is obvious that consciousness can be layered. That is, you can have one thing going on in focal consciousness, while nevertheless you're